Welcome to the Podcast Editor Mastermind Show. I am Steve. Check this out, Stuart. And over to my left in this camera screen is Mr. Mark Deal.
Hey, everyone. I am Mark Deal over to the left of the camera screen. And I guess that's the order that Steve's going to have it in post. It's always funny to like peer behind the curtain and talk about, the live recording versus what the production has done in post. And then you lock some of that stuff in, Steve, when you say to the left or the right.
Yeah, and I always like to put my guests in the middle, so I should not have done that. But people want to see it in the video. There you go. Jeremy Enns is with us today. He is the founder of Podcast Marketing Academy, oh man, this guy, you've been in the industry for a while now, and you've been tough on this marketing for at least 6 years, I think now.
Something like that. Yeah, I would say I started in 2019 was when I started getting into the marketing side of things. So yeah, we're at 6 years right about now.
What is podcast marketing and how important is it to the actual growth of a show?
That's an interesting question that I think can be interpreted many ways. And so what's interesting is if you look at, let's say, the business community, you might look at podcast marketing as podcasting as a means to market your business. Whereas within podcasting, you think of podcast marketing as getting your show out in front of more people. That's actually one small part of podcast marketing is getting in front of more people. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes around to like when you get in front of people, does the show get their attention and are they attracted to it enough that they're going to actually click into it and hopefully sample an episode? And then there's the internal side of marketing, which is once people click play, does the show retain them and get them listening through the first episode and coming back for more? And so I would say that basically marketing for a podcast is how do you essentially grow your subscriber count or your listen count. And that really encompasses everything from the editorial decisions, the content strategy, to your exposure strategy, to your cover art and packaging, and basically everything else that goes into creating a show.
You said the editing helps with the marketing. I've got to dig into that piece. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there's a big part of... So there's two parts of this that I think are related. There's partly show format and structure that can make editing easier a lot of times. And then there's also the actual editing of clipping, whatever that is out, whether that's ums and ahs and kind of the technical polishing and editing, or if it's more editorial based, like taking big 10-minute chunks out at a time or whatever that might be. And so essentially if you want somebody to listen to more episodes, they probably first need to listen through one episode. Every new listener needs to listen to one before they're going to listen to two and so on. And so when we think about like all of the effort that we're putting into growth, again, usually we're thinking about exposure, but if we have to get 15 people in for one to stick around, like that's pretty poorly kind of very inefficient marketing. And so we'd rather have, 12 out of those 15 people who click the play on the show once keep listening through the first episode and coming back for more. And a big part of that is actually having shows that feel like there's momentum behind them, that they're not lagging and lulling, and that there's a lot of the kind of not even dead air, but just like conversational lulls where not much is happening and there's not any kind of consistent delivery of whatever the payoffs that the show offers is. And so this is something that I think started thinking through a few years ago when I was getting more interested in YouTube. This is even pre-YouTube in podcasting conversation. But if you examine and like consume any content around YouTube video creation, you know how valuable and how much emphasis they put on pacing, especially in the first like 30 seconds to a minute, but also throughout the episode is like, and it's partly because YouTube is a really brutal platform where they are actively trying to get people to click away from your video by presenting them with other videos they might like right in the window. Podcasting, we actually have some kind of insulation against that. Usually when people click play on an episode, it takes a decent amount for them to tune out. But I think when you think about that lens of like, okay, this is happening, like people's attention is wanting to wander most of the time. And so how do we create shows that actually make it hard for that to happen? And so again, part of this is how you're structuring your episodes. And then part of this is just eliminating anything that can be eliminated from the show. And in my experience, in my perspective, I think it is hard to make an episode worse by cutting content out. I think almost any time you're cutting something out, the episode is going to be better in the end. And so I typically, when I'm editing my episodes, I set a goal, an arbitrary goal off the bat where I'm like, okay, my goal is to cut 20 to 30% of the content. I don't know how I'm going to do it because I believe that every single minute is gold when I go in there, but I'm like, I have set a goal. So if this is an hour-long episode, I got to cut 20 minutes from this episode. And this was a good episode. That's just the goal I set for myself. And I believe that every time I do that, the finished episode is better than it was if I left everything in.
I found that too. I always seem to even without trying, end up turning a 60-minute episode into, well, it's 12 to 18% is the average that the raw length gets cut down by. Surprisingly, I don't know why. But when you started talking about editing and marketing, I was thinking, oh, he's going to talk about finding that snippet to put at the beginning, the teaser, or maybe where do you put the ad break so it's less disruptive? That's where I think editors have some influence on the final recording, which, then the marketing is the ad break. But okay, let's get into the survey results because I always find data interesting. I know Mark loves data. Is it data or data, Mark? Tell me which one's correct.
Oh, I am totally not going to make a Star Trek reference there. So we'll just go with whatever you say, Steve.
Okay. Well, I put a link in the show notes for where the Podcast Marketing Trends report is at podcastmarketingacademy.com, and there's a long URL there. But Jeremy's going to share his screen with us. We're going to go through a couple of the slides that I think pertain to us, which are podcast editors, podcast coaches, podcast managers, and the directors like Mark. But I want to go down to, first of all, let's just real talk about the first one is the audio, video, or both slide, because that's been a big change recently, and a lot of editors have to deal with both. So what have you got in the results of the people that you did have complete the survey?
Yeah, I was very surprised by this because, it's been hard to escape the conversation around video in podcasting for the past certainly 2 years. It was kind of creeping in for the previous years before that already. But my gut was still that most people were not doing video. And actually what we found was that it was basically a 50-50 split. And so we had 48.9% of people were doing audio only. And then 49.8, so 1% more, were doing audio and video. And then 1.3% were doing video only. So tiny percentage of people were only video. So audio is still basically 99% of people creating, at least who filled out this survey, who are creating podcasts are doing audio. And basically half of those are also doing video. And so I suspected it might be like a third of people were doing video, but it was, fairly even split here.
And within the survey, was there any way to identify the type of video? Meaning, was it the full episode? Was it just a part of it? Was it just doing the video shorts?
Yeah, so this was something that I was very curious about, and I have actually asked this in previous surveys as well. And so what we have here, basically 55.6% of people were posting shorts repurposed from podcast episodes. And actually, I should say these are non-exclusive answers. So some people were posting many of these things. So essentially 56% of people were posting shorts. 48% of people were posting full episodes with kind of minimal video production. So probably like topping and tailing and not too many visual effects or anything like that. 42% of people were posting static image or waveform. 24% of people were posting full episodes with significant video production. And the fact that like those three, there's three different answers there for posting full videos that add up to more than 100%. So I'm guessing some people post a mix where some might be some more extensive video production and others are going to be more minimal. And then we have 21% of people were posting non-podcast videos to YouTube. So they were like YouTube first videos that they were posting there in addition to their podcast, I would say. And so that's something that I know a lot of creators and business owners are doing where they have the podcast. There's a video version on YouTube. They also create separate video content that also goes on YouTube. And then there was 18% of people were posting, or almost 19% of people posting like original shorts. And so shorts that were not repurposed from the podcast. The most common one was shorts. Many people were doing that, over half. And then we get into a bunch of other ways and types of videos that people were posting.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to marketing, those shorts, I'll tell you, those are big deals.
Are they?
Yes, Mark.
No, I say are they because we talked about what matters, and this is a marketing focused episode on what is the impact. So I know for like audio only podcasts, you look at essentially download numbers and maybe Apple Podcasts Connect or Spotify looking how much the playthrough is. And I know YouTube gives you similar stats as far as like the number of plays and how far along people get into the video. So since about half the people are audio only and half the people are doing both audio and video, were there different ways in which you measured success in this survey to find out which one is working or what matters or if it was worth it altogether?
We're going to actually be doing a subsequent report in the next month or so. So by the time this episode is live, there's going to be a subsequent report on video versus audio where I have all the data and just didn't include it in this version of the report as it was going to get quite bloated. So there's going to be more on that coming soon. But I think like the question about shorts is actually very interesting because I think shorts can work phenomenally well for certain types of shows. And they're I would almost say, complete waste of time for probably actually most shows. And I think the shows that they work for are often comedy or pop culture shows, and you have to have the right hosts. Like it has to be people who get the vibe of the social media platforms that they're posting on and are they're using the podcast as a way to feed into like actually maybe Instagram as their main channel. And the podcast just happens to be, they know the type of content that will do well on Instagram. And so they're programming that into their show structure. And so that I think can work really well. And that comes down to having like bits or segments within the feed that like are structured around a hook that will work on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube Shorts. And then there's also a larger conversation. And like I was talking to a friend last week who was telling me about a podcast, and I was saying, oh, what's the podcast name? And she said, oh, I don't actually know the name. I just watch it on Instagram. And I was like, oh, interesting. And you hear this so much, the way that people, like it is a podcast, but she has never listened to an episode. She is a podcast listener, just not for this show. She only consumes the clips, and they're a very specific type of concept that clip is. Every single time it's the same thing. It comes from the main episode feed, but it's just one part of the episode. That's something that they have a huge social following, but I don't know how much of that actually translates to the podcast.
It'd be interesting to find out if one platform performs better for another because of the type of content or show that they do. I mean, Instagram is a very visual platform. It doesn't help with the marketing piece.
No, I personally feel from this, you have to ask the client or prospective client, what do they want to get out of it? You know, if they want to have a content mine for their Instagram feed, because that's where they're building their audience, that's where they're building connections, and that's where they're bringing people in, then you structure the show, we're talking the show as a, podcast in a way that it's a content mine for Instagram. Like one episode could be like 10, 20, 30 little snippet reels, whatever, on their platform of choice. If their goal is to get podcast episode downloads or people to consume long form content, then you're probably going to structure that differently, because people don't, at least I feel, and maybe there's a marketing report for it, that people don't spend 30 minutes to get deep level knowledge, deep level connection on these real shorts platform. In fact, it's kind of built into the name, and a lot of the platforms have those limitations. So I think it really depends. You have to ask the clients, and then you have to listen when you ask them, hey, what is it you want to get out of it? And then you kind of restate what they want, and then maybe try to alter that in a way that, kind of resembles the services you offer. Vice just kind of shoving them like, oh, here's a podcast. You want a podcast? This is a podcast. This is what you're going to get. And this is all I work on. Jeremy, you bring up a great point. I never really thought that people themselves as listeners, as content consumers, consider themselves podcast listeners if they follow somebody on Instagram and watch every one of their reels. And for them, consuming that, what we're going to call a podcast here on this podcast, is a lot of those short form content. Like, oh, I'm going to get the content, but I'm going to get it in 20, 30 segments interlaced with a lot of other stuff, or I'll just go to that person's reel and do segment by segment. So that's interesting to me. And it really kind of flies in the face of the traditional definition of podcast, which I think a lot of us that have been doing this for a while, we held true to that. The original definition of, audio syndicated on RSS feed, and kind of toss it out. I was like, what does I don't want to even say listener, what does the content consumer, what do they consider a podcast when they tell somebody, hey, I watched a podcast on YouTube, or I watched a podcast on Instagram. Yeah. Now in, 2026, right around the corner, we as these producers have to be mindful and open and like, all right, if the listeners identify themselves as listeners, how do I produce the content that they're going to consume?
Yeah. And this is like there's just so much evidence of this where I was listening to an episode of Creator Science recently with Jay Klaus. He was talking with Jeff Umbro from the Podglomerate. And Jay shared in that episode that he'd done some research on his. So he's got a very successful YouTube channel where he posts some podcast episodes. And then he's got the original audio only feed, which was how the show started. And he was saying that he'd asked his audience in YouTube saying like, hey, if you watch here, do you also listen to the podcast feed? And he got a number of people saying that like, no, I won't listen if it's not on YouTube. I will only consume if there's a video version. And you see this from a lot of other people as well. My co-host Justin Jackson from transistor.fm this was at the podcast show London this year. He was him and one of his team members were at like some local pub there in London, and there was this I think family from New Zealand or something like that. And so we had like 2 or 3 generations that were like there, and they all consume podcast. Actually, I think the dad was maybe like in his 60s or maybe even older, and he watched podcasts and he did watch podcasts. And so Justin was asking like, how do you engage with podcasts? And the dad, he's like, well, like on YouTube, of course. Like, how else would you do it? And Justin was like, you never thought about like audio? And he's like, well, what's the point if there's no video? And so it's like there are consumers who like do not see the value in audio only and like will choose to only do the video version, which is, a little bit sad to me. I love both mediums, but it's certainly a heavier lift to do video. And so it does make it less accessible for a lot of creators.
To me, it's the difference between an audiobook and reading a paper book versus reading a Kindle. There is a difference in each medium, and you can be more creative with another or have more impact with one over the other. So it hurts me when he says, how else would you do it if he's like, there's no video? Because that just dismisses everything that has been happening in the podcast industry for the previous 20 years. But, it is the way that things are going. Let me get off of that soapbox. Let's move back to some of the data from your survey. Because for podcast editors and for coaches and consultants, this is important. Go back to the business model. When we talk about the respondents and their business model, you actually asked them what was the reason for their show. And that number one result I thought was the most interesting because I find that a lot of podcast editors work for this type of person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the number one was 34% of people were coaches or consultants. And so keep in mind here, the percentages here are only people who said that their podcast was in service of a business. So there's a bunch of people who are not doing the shows for businesses, but of the people who were producing their shows as a marketing channel for the business, the clear winner, more than twice as much as any other business model, was coach or consultant.
And the second you got is freelance service provider, which is kind of in the same way. They've got a business that they're supporting by having a show. An agency, is that what is an agency?
So this would be, this is a little bit interesting because of who's responding to this. There were some agency owners who are podcast production agency owners who filled out the survey. They may have put themselves in this category, but I actually assume they do produce their own shows that are meant to get clients for their agency. So they still kind of actually fit into this, but that could be other, design agencies, web development agencies, any kind of like that business model, which is still, it's just a variation on the service provider type of a business model, I would say.
Okay. And then what I really love is the 1.5% said they're doing the podcast. The business model is advertising and sponsorships, which we thought would be way bigger because of the amount of time and effort put behind talking about and seeking out sponsorships.
Yeah. That's always been a bit of a mystery to me. I think people feel like it's free money. And I don't think I've worked with lots of people who have sponsors, and I doubt any of them would say that that's their business model because it's kind of like an add-on. It's something else where their main business model is usually, the people I've worked with are coaches or consultants. That's the most common, or service providers. It kind of reflects this data here. They know what actually powers the business is they work with clients. But I think a lot of people have the dream of just being able to produce the show and then get sponsors and advertisers to fund it. And so that's something like I actually have a friend right now. He has a show. Within 2 years of starting it, it's become the number one show in his space. And he said the low floor for that show right now is $300,000 a year. The interesting thing is it also got him an opportunity to become a co-founder, to be brought on as a co-founder of a startup that has now just received several millions of dollars in funding and seems to have a very bright future. And the funny thing is he's like, yeah, so, this is going to be my full-time thing now, the startup for the next few years. But really, like, I'm hoping that just after, 4 or 5 years, I'll just be able to do the podcast full-time. And so he's like, in his mind, the podcast, like, that is somebody whose business model is advertising and sponsorships. But he's like got this bigger opportunity that could make him very wealthy. And he's still like, yeah, I kind of just like want to do the podcast. I'm going to do this well for right now, but this is a short-term thing. The podcast is a long thing. And so it's really fascinating to see like how often these different business models blend and overlap. And the other interesting thing for him is like the podcast, the reason he got brought on with the startup is because his podcast is the distribution and marketing channel for the startup. And so he's basically the marketing guy that these other two co-founders who are more technical were like, hey, he's got the audience. He's got exactly the people we need. Let's bring him on as a co-founder. And he's got all the connections from his guests and everything. And so I think that's another interesting thing that podcasters don't think about as an opportunity to look into, especially if you're in certain spaces as well. So yeah, it's sponsorships. I find fascinating the reality of how many people make it work and compared to how many people like want to make that their full-time job.
Yeah. My first client was a content creator in the blogging space before she started a podcast. And for 3 years, let me start again. She did get sponsorships, but it wasn't until about 1.5 years into the first 3 years. And then at about the 3rd year mark, a course that she had been working on pretty much the full time, she launched it. Now I did some rude math, which is basically taking numbers that I got off the internet and other places that I found and just put it into place and said, okay, if she's charging this much and she got this many customers or clients to buy her course, she made $1 million. Now, she was making some money from sponsorships, but she made way more money from selling her course 3 years into it. So yeah, that would put her into, one of those first 2 categories. The reason for the business was exposure to her platform, to her products and services versus, selling ads to, saying, hey, Indeed.com.
Yeah. I think sponsorships are one of the hardest ways to make money. And I think the appeal that a lot of people have is like, well, I just get to create the show and then I'm going to get paid for it. But what you don't realize is you are still essentially a service provider and to some extent a consultant as well. And I would say like the people who I know who make the most from sponsorships actually approach it as their sponsors are their clients and they are a consultant. And they're kind of like a one-person media agency who they can go to a client and say, okay, if you were to hire an agency to do what I'm going to give you, creative direction, coming out with campaigns and episode ideas and doing all the, ad scripting and everything like that, the delivery, this might cost you 25 grand or 50 grand. I'll charge you 5 grand for this package or whatever, 10 grand. And so it starts to look like a great deal, but you're actually having to take that initiative and go in and be the leader in the space because they don't know what they want. They don't know how this is going to help their business. And so if you can take that role, you suddenly start to be able to charge a lot more. But then you're kind of just back into this like coach, consultant, service provider role. And so sponsorships end up kind of just being the same thing where you're dealing with sales, you're dealing with client management, you're dealing with giving reports on how the podcast is performing. And it's just like at the end of the day, there's always a boss somewhere. And so I think that that's something that if people knew what goes into actually running a full-time sponsorship business and all the pitching that needs to go onto it on a constant basis, it's a lot of work and it's not a business model I would actually want.
Yeah, we do some ads in our show, but it's for our own product. And I have clients who do ads and they do the whole ad read thing. And it's a fight to get them to record every week. And they have to read the same thing over and over again, which I think is interesting. The copy never changes, but they have to read it again. It's a lot of work. But it's also hard to sell your own product and content as well. So I guess it depends on how much effort do you really want to put into it versus you got to see what the results are, of course, at the end. If it's not working, you got to change. And now with the media hosts, a lot of media hosts are offering dynamic programmatic ads. Here, just click this button and you get ads put in your show. Just tell us where. And oh, that's easy. They've got to remember, and this is something that the coaches and us have to tell our clients, is we got to remember that, disrupting the show disrupts the show. You put an ad in the middle of a conversation and people have the choice to leave. We see a lot of drop off there. We see people skipping the ad, so they're not very effective. But you do get the monetary benefit from that. So I want to go to one last place, which I know impacts people here who are watching and listening, is the show topic by growth rate. So you actually had people in the survey say, my show fits under this major I believe there's a top level categories, not necessarily the individual ones, the subcategories in there. And look at that number one. Look at that.
Yeah. So this is a little bit, the survey is somewhat skewed to my audience, and I tend to attract more people who are in the business category. So that's worth keeping in mind. Now, every year we do try to get it out as far as possible in the podcasting space. And so there are lots of people, I would say, from usually half the responses come from my audience, and then the rest come from a variety of other sources. But yeah, business is the first one here. And it was interesting, this year that business shows way outperformed the average growth rate here. So that is interesting. We also see some of the other kind of education outperform the average. TV and film vastly outperformed the average. But those were kind of some of the outliers here. Business, education, and TV and film were the categories that did better than shows in other categories.
I would think, though, that people who are doing a show in the business type categories, they are more serious about selling their product and services. They're willing to put the money behind hiring podcast coaches, podcast managers, podcast editors, things like that. So I'm not too surprised by that number one being there. I don't think it's skewed too much by what you said, which, most of the people who but since we need to get that out there and you're going to be doing the survey again here in 2026, how can I tease my clients to get them to fill out this survey for you next year?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a bunch of prizes that you can win that I offer a bunch of stuff that's podcast marketing, education related. And there's also some sponsors will be putting up prizes. So there is a kind of actual, very direct incentive to enter the survey there if you're interested. But also, it's just contributing to this, like the more data we get in this every year, the better the data is and the more reliable it is. And so I am always trying to get as many people from as many categories and niches and different parts of the world and all these different types of variables to fill it out because, a lot of times we get some, if we're looking at the same kind of chart right now here, if we're looking at the kids and family category, we just don't get many responses there. And so that data is not really as reliable as where we get more responses in other categories. And so it's nice, the more we get, the more niches, the more useful it is for everyone.
And where should they go?
They can go to podcastmarketingtrends.com/survey.
Podcastmarketingtrends.com/survey. Very easy to go to. We can send our clients there and have them fill out the survey. And we can do this again next year.
Perfect.
Well, Jeremy, so you talked a little bit about some of the different topics and things that we're seeing significant growth. It also looked like that high growth shows are often operating on smaller budgets. Would you agree? Did the data show that?
So this was something that we've seen actually several years in a row. And there's a little bit an interesting distinction here that a lot of the big shows, so I slice the data generally by big versus small and high growth versus low growth. And so one thing to keep in mind is that it's easier for a small show, let's say a show that has 100 downloads an episode, it can 10x in size and go up to 1,000 downloads an episode. That's much easier than a show that already has 100,000 downloads, 10xing in size to go up to 1 million downloads an episode. That's going to be, very few shows ever do that. And so smaller shows will tend to have higher growth rates. But I think there's also something like what we saw in this survey in particular, and what we've actually seen over the past few years is the bigger, kind of more established shows seem to be losing audience. And so I think that this is probably a lagging kind of effect of a lot of new shows starting in and around the pandemic and then afterwards as well, the kind of new energy coming into podcasting. And then, we also talked about listener behavior where a lot of people are consuming podcasts without ever listening to the audio version. And so I think there's actually lots of innovation where people who might be those kinds of listeners are making podcasts that are in new formats that are not like the old shows that started 10 years ago. And so I think there's actually lots of growth from new up and coming shows that don't have big budgets yet, but are being more creative with their formats and concepts and might just be more plugged into like what's working now in marketing at these more kind of algorithmically driven channels and possibly taking advantage of those. So it's really hard to say 100% why this is happening, but it is encouraging to see that a lot of the shows that are growing quickly, actually it's like reverse correlated with their budgets, which is fascinating.
Okay. Looking at the big picture, we're in December now. So a lot of people are already thinking, this year's behind us. We're looking forward to the next year. And what are some of the things that I can do in my business and my podcast production business? What are things that I can do to help my clients better succeed and reach their goals and thereby, keeping us around? Is there any advice you have for podcast production businesses specifically based off the survey data?
Yeah, it's interesting that, so I remember first coming across Descript as a platform. So I'm a sound engineer. I went to school for audio production and sound engineering. And I remember coming across Descript in, I don't know, 2017 or 18, and was just kind of like scared and furious and was like, oh, this is going to take all our jobs. And like, who do they think they are? And then after I got out of actually producing podcasts for clients and am now like a full-time kind of creator for myself, I was like, man, Descript is awesome. And then I started to wanting to outsource my own Descript editing. And I had such a hard time finding anyone who could do both audio and video editing in Descript. I had to search far and wide. And there was one guy, I can't remember his name, but he has in LinkedIn, in his profile, it's like Descript editor. It's something like that. And I was like, wow, this guy's so easy to find because he puts Descript. And like, there are more tools that are opening up that are like that, but Descript is still the best known. And there's lots of things I find annoying about it. But when it comes to efficiency, and when we're looking at like half of people are doing audio and video production, I think making it easy for people to hire you based on like, yes, we can work in this collaborative tool. And like I'm trained in Pro Tools. I love Pro Tools, but I'm not editing video there. And so basically I don't think I've opened Pro Tools up in like 3 or 4 years now. And it's just Descript is like, I do most things audio and video. I like the editing by the doc style kind of word editing, and it's collaborative with my other team members. And so it just has become a much easier kind of place, even though I can't do all the mixing and kind of more advanced editing that I would do in Pro Tools. It's just like, well, for what I need this to do, this is more than good enough. And I think that as a producer, as an editor, I know like the loyalty that I have to tools, and especially like audio editors and specifically sound engineers can be super elitist. And I have certainly come from that background. And I think that just, I mean, you can take that positioning. It's just that you are eliminating a significant percentage of potential clients there. And so there's always going to be people who want that like best possible quality audio podcast. I think if that's the case that you're going to take, you need to like really plant that flag and build a compelling case around it. Or there's the option of there's more and more people who are going to be looking to do both of these. How can I help them as efficiently as possible? And part of that is maybe looking into changing tool sets or at least cross educating yourself on other platforms.
Okay. Thank you. So it sounds like not just focus on the outcome you help your clients achieve, but also perhaps some of the tools that you use. And, you mentioned name dropping if you like Pro Tools or Descript, or maybe a podcast production professional could say, hey, I use the latest tools or the emerging trends in AI to help my production so you can have, a better, quicker, faster, whatever it may be. But that way you mentioned not just what you do, but also how you do it, and for people looking for that. Obviously, if people are looking to outsource or white label some of their production flow that they already have, they're looking specifically for tools. And I get that. I'm kind of the same way with web development. There's a lot of things I like doing myself, and I look specifically for like, I need someone who can X, Y, Z very specifically. And maybe there's people that are doing that for, podcast editors. Naming those tools makes sense. Otherwise, maybe mention that you use some of the latest tools or embrace AI, which it sounds like we've all had that same reaction, right? Jeremy, you mentioned when you first discovered Descript, you're like, oh, how's it trying to do what I do, automatically? And there's so much more and more of that every day. In fact, AI is now coming after the content creators themselves. A lot of the stuff that they do, the delivery of the ad reads and everything can be done with, anyway, I could go on and on what AI can do these days, but maybe saying that you embrace it and kind of riding that edge to get the most out of it by just ignoring it.
Yeah, that's actually something when I was hiring my audio and video editor, that was in my job description. I was like, I want you to be bringing ideas to me on like, if like, I'm kind of not the expert on production anymore because I don't do it actively very much. Whereas I used to edit, I don't know, like 20 hours of podcasts a week or something like that. Probably not that much. Probably spent 40 hours editing or 50 hours editing when things were really busy at the start before I built systems. But like, that was all I did was edit podcasts. And now it's much more of a occasional thing for my own shows when I'm in season. But I wanted my editor, I was looking for somebody in the job description, somebody who's familiar with all the video and audio AI tools and can bring me ideas on how can we make this more efficient. And I think the thing that editors often worry about is, well, let's say I'm getting paid hourly, and if I'm able to do the same job in half the time, then and now I need to get twice the number of clients to make that same kind of rate that I would otherwise get. Whereas I don't know that I'm certainly not like all clients, but I was like, I have a list of like 150 videos that we can make and edit. And like, I just want to get more bang for my buck. So if you are faster at doing this, we get to do more videos and you're going to make the same amount and I'm going to get a better outcome. And so I think that that's the kind of angle. I mean, this is just true in all client work and freelancing, is understanding where the client's coming from and what do they want to get out of this and how do we position ourselves so that we're the obvious solution to that and we're kind of speaking their language rather than saying this is how I do it and this is why you need to do this. It's kind of like, well, what are they trying to get? Where are they already trying to get to go, and how do we position ourselves as like the bridge to help them get there?
That's where we should end this episode, Steve. Ask your clients what they want to get and how together we can get there. Jeremy, that's great advice, especially using some of the insight that you're providing with the podcast growth trends. And in fact, there is an update you mentioned earlier in this episode with more detailed data. We, at the time of this recording, don't have access to that. But you, dear listener, if you're listening to this or watching it on whatever platform you happen to be on, that data is available. So check out the link in the show notes and not only see the overall podcast growth trends, but maybe some of the detailed specific data that Jeremy's going to be providing after this episode drops. Jeremy Enns, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Editor Mastermind.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.